My grandson leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. I stayed silent. I didn't react. But that night, I followed my own son. I used to believe that the worst things in life happen to other people, to families you read about, to stories you hear and feel sorry for, but never truly expect to live yourself. And for years, that belief gave me a kind of quiet comfort, a sense that no matter how imperfect things were, there were lines that simply wouldn't be crossed inside my own home, inside my own family, especially not by someone I had raised with my own hands, someone I thought I understood better than anyone else in the world. My son wasn't always distant. He wasn't always the man people would later describe him as. There was a time when he laughed easily, when he spoke openly, when he looked at the world with a kind of softness that made me believe he would grow into someone strong, someone kind, someone who would build a life better than the one I had struggled to provide. And maybe that's why it took me so long to see what was right in front of me, because when you carry an image of someone for too long, you don't notice when they slowly become someone else. The house itself never gave anything away. Not at first. It looked like any other home, quiet, organized, filled with the small routines that make life feel stable, meals at regular times, lights turning off at night, voices coming and going in familiar patterns. And if you walked through it without paying attention, you would never think twice about what might be happening behind closed doors, because nothing about it felt chaotic, nothing felt broken. Everything looked normal, but normal can be misleading. Because the truth is, not everything that's wrong looks loud. Not everything dangerous announces itself. Sometimes it hides in silence, in subtle changes, in things so small you can easily dismiss them if you want to. And that's exactly what I did at first. I dismissed it. I explained away. I told myself there had to be another reason, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to accept. It started with small things most people wouldn't even notice. The way my granddaughter stopped talking as much as she used to, the way she stayed close to her brother instead of playing freely, the way her eyes changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone immediately, but enough to create a feeling you couldn't quite explain, a quiet discomfort that lingered just beneath the surface. And I noticed it. Of course I did. But noticing something and accepting what it might mean are two very different things. So I chose the easier path. I told myself she was just going through a phase, that children change, that maybe something had happened at school, that maybe I was overthinking. Because sometimes the mind would rather create a dozen harmless explanations than face one uncomfortable truth. Until the day my grandson leaned in close and whispered something that changed everything. The day itself didn't feel important at first. It wasn't marked by anything unusual, no loud argument, no obvious tension, nothing that would make you stop and think that something significant was about to unfold. And that's what makes moments like that so dangerous. They arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary days, disguised as routine, and if you're not paying attention, they pass by without leaving a trace, without giving you the chance to act before it's too late. I had come over like I usually did, nothing out of the ordinary, just another visit, another afternoon spent inside a house I'd walked through countless times before, a place that felt familiar in every possible way, the same furniture, the same smells, the same quiet hum of life moving forward without interruption. And yet, even as I stepped inside, there was something subtle in the air, something I couldn't immediately define, not strong enough to alarm me, but present enough to linger in the back of my mind. My grandson was the first to approach me, as he always did, full of energy, eager to talk, eager to share whatever small detail had captured his attention that day, and I greeted him the same way I always had, smiling, listening, letting him pull me into his world for a few minutes before settling into the slower rhythm of the house. And for a moment, everything felt normal again, just another visit, just another day, nothing to question, nothing to doubt. But then I saw her. My granddaughter was sitting a little further away, not isolated, but not engaged either, her body present, but her attention somewhere else. And the difference wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to stand out once you noticed it, enough to make you pause for a second longer than usual, enough to create that quiet question in your mind that doesn't fully form into words, but refuses to disappear. I watched her for a while without saying anything, not because I didn't care, but because I was trying to understand what I was seeing before reacting to it. And the more I observed, the more I realized that this wasn't just a bad mood. This wasn't just a child being quiet. There was a pattern to it. Something consistent in the way she behaved, especially when her father was nearby, a tension that appeared and disappeared depending on his presence, subtle, but undeniable once you saw it, clearly. And still, I said nothing, because saying something would mean acknowledging something, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Later that afternoon, while I was sitting in the living room, half distracted by the television, half lost in my own thoughts, my grandson came closer again, but this time, there was something different about the way he approached me, slower, more careful, like he wasn't just coming to talk, but to say something he wasn't sure how to say, and I remember noticing it immediately, the hesitation, the way his eyes moved briefly toward the hallway before returning to me. He leaned in, closer than usual, and then, in a voice so low it almost disappeared before reaching me, he whispered something. At first, I didn't fully understand it. Not because the words were unclear, but because my mind didn't want to process them, didn't want to place them in the context they belonged. So I did what most people do in that moment. I smiled. I nodded. I pretended everything was still normal. But something inside me had already started to change. I kept thinking about what he said long after that moment passed, not in a clear, organized way, but in fragments, like pieces of something that didn't quite fit together yet. And even as I tried to focus on everything else around me, the normal rhythm of the house, the sound of dishes in the kitchen, the low hum of the television, conversations that didn't require much attention, there was a part of my mind that stayed locked on those words, repeating them quietly, over and over again, trying to make sense of something I wasn't ready to fully understand. At first, I did what most people do when faced with something uncomfortable. I minimized it. I reshaped it into something harmless. I told myself that children sometimes say things out of context, that maybe he misunderstood something, that maybe he was describing something innocent in a way that just sounded strange, because the alternative required a level of awareness I wasn't prepared to accept. And it's strange how the human mind works, how quickly it builds walls to protect itself from truths it doesn't want to face. But the more I watched, the harder it became to hold on to those explanations. It wasn't just one moment. It wasn't just one detail. It was a pattern, a quiet, consistent pattern that revealed itself in small ways in how my granddaughter moved through the house, in how she positioned herself in relation to others, in how her energy shifted depending on who was nearby. And once I started seeing it, really seeing it, it became impossible to ignore, like noticing a crack in a wall that you somehow missed before. And now that you see it, you can't pretend it's not there. She stayed close to her brother more than usual, not in a playful way, but in a protective way, like being near him made her feel safer. And when she had to move away from him, even for something simple, there was a hesitation, a brief pause, like she was calculating something before taking a step. And these were not behaviors you could easily explain as mood swings or personality changes. They carried something deeper, something that spoke without words. I tried to talk to her at one point, casually, not making it obvious that I was paying close attention, asking simple questions, how she was feeling, how school was going, the kind of questions adults ask when they don't want to alarm a child. But her answers were short, careful, almost rehearsed, like she had learned to keep things contained. And while nothing she said was alarming on the surface, the way she said it, the lack of openness, the distance in her tone, told me more than her words ever could. And then there was my son. At first, I didn't want to connect anything to him directly, not consciously, because doing so would mean crossing a line I had spent years believing didn't exist. But as the day went on, I started noticing things I had overlooked before, small things, subtle behaviors, the way he interacted with the children, the lack of warmth, the absence of attention, and more importantly, the way he seemed completely unaware of the atmosphere around him, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. He moved through the house like everything was normal, like everything was fine, and that somehow made it worse. Because when something is wrong and one person acts like it isn't, it forces everyone else into silence. By the time evening came, I wasn't just thinking about what my grandson had said anymore. I was feeling it, not as a clear conclusion, not as something I could put into words, but as a growing certainty that something in that house wasn't right, something that had been building quietly, unnoticed or ignored, and now that I had been pulled into it, even if just slightly, I couldn't step away from it anymore. Dinner was quiet that night, quieter than usual, and I paid attention to every detail. The way my granddaughter avoided looking up, the way my grandson tried to fill the silence with small talk, the way my son remained distant, present physically but disconnected from everything else. And the entire time, I felt that same tension sitting just beneath the surface, like something waiting to happen, something that hadn't fully revealed itself yet, but was already there. And as I sat there, watching all of it unfold in front of me, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. This wasn't new. This had been happening for a while, and I had just started noticing. That night stayed with me in a way I couldn't shake, not because something obvious had happened, but because of everything that hadn't: the silence, the distance, the way each person in that house seemed to be living in the same space, but carrying something completely different inside. And as I lay in bed later, trying to rest, I realized that the discomfort I felt wasn't coming from uncertainty anymore. It was coming from recognition, from the slow understanding that what I had seen during the day was not random, not temporary, but part of something deeper that had been unfolding quietly for longer than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual, without announcing beforehand, telling myself it was just a spontaneous visit, just a decision to spend more time with the children. But deep down, I knew exactly why I was there. I wasn't visiting anymore. I was observing. I was looking for confirmation, for clarity, for anything that could either prove me wrong or push me toward a truth I was still resisting. And as I stepped into the house, I felt it again, that same subtle shift in the air, that same quiet heaviness that had begun to follow me from room to room. My granddaughter was in the living room when I walked in, sitting on the floor with a book open in front of her. But she wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on the same page, unmoving, as if she had been staring at it for a long time without actually seeing it. And when she noticed me, she gave a small smile, polite, controlled, the kind of smile that exists more out of habit than emotion. And while anyone else might have accepted it at face value, I couldn't, not anymore, not after everything. I had started to notice. I sat down nearby, not too close, giving her space, letting the moment settle naturally. And for a few minutes, we stayed like that, sharing the same room without speaking. And it was in that silence that I saw it more clearly than before, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands held the edges of the book just a little too tightly, the way her eyes occasionally shifted toward the hallway, quickly, almost unconsciously, as if she was checking something, without wanting to make it obvious. And then I heard it, footsteps, coming from down the hallway. Slow, steady, familiar. Her father. The reaction was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable once you were paying attention. Her body stiffened slightly, her grip on the book tightened, and her eyes dropped instantly, as if avoiding even the possibility of eye contact. And in that moment, I didn't need explanations. I didn't need confirmation, because what I saw in that small reaction told me more than any words ever could. He walked into the room casually, like nothing in the world was wrong, like this was just another normal morning, and he greeted me with a simple nod. No surprise at seeing me there earlier than usual, no curiosity about why I had come, just that same distant presence I started to notice more and more. And as he stood there for a moment, I watched the space between them, the distance that existed even when they were only a few feet apart, and it felt wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. Anymore, I forced a normal conversation, asking him simple things, routine questions, giving him the opportunity to act like everything was fine, and he did, answering without hesitation, without any sign of discomfort, and that somehow made everything heavier, because when one person carries tension and another carries none at all, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. It becomes visible even in the smallest interactions. Later that day, I found another moment with my grandson, and this time, I didn't approach the conversation casually. I didn't pretend I was just making small talk. I looked at him directly, gently, but with intention, and I asked him to tell me again what it meant the day before. not in a way that would scare him, but in a way that made it clear I was listening, that what he had said mattered, and he hesitated for a second, just a second, before leaning closer once again. And when he spoke, his words didn't explain everything, but they made one thing very clear. This wasn't just in my head. He didn't speak right away. And that silence, coming from a child who usually had no trouble talking, carried more weight than anything could have said immediately. And I could see it in his face, the hesitation, the way he looked down for a brief moment, like he was deciding whether or not to say something he knew might change things. And in that pause, I understood something important. This wasn't just about information anymore. This was about trust, about whether he felt safe enough to say what he was holding inside. So I didn't rush him. I didn't fill the silence. I just stayed there, calm, steady, letting him feel that there was no pressure, no urgency, just space. And after a few seconds it felt longer than they should have, he leaned in again, closer than before, his voice dropping to that same whisper that had started everything. But this time, there was less uncertainty in it, less confusion, and more something else, something closer to clarity. He told me that it didn't happen every night, but often enough that he had started noticing a pattern, that his father would wait until everything was quiet, until the lights were off, until no one was moving to the house, and then he would walk down the hallway and go into his sister's room. And at first, he thought it was just normal, something parents do, checking if their children are okay. But then he started noticing the difference, the way his sister reacted the next day, the way she became quieter, more distant, more withdrawn. I listened carefully, holding on to every word, every pause, every detail that might help me understand what he couldn't fully explain. And I asked him gently what he meant when he said it felt different, not pushing, not forcing him to define something he might not have the words for. And he struggled for a moment, searching for a way to describe a feeling that didn't belong to him directly, but that he had still recognized as wrong. "She doesn't like it," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "She gets really quiet, like she's scared to say something." That was enough. More than enough. Because children don't need to understand everything to recognize when something isn't right. And neither do we. I felt something shift inside me in that moment. Something that replaced hesitation with a kind of quiet certainty, not a loud realization, not a dramatic conclusion, but something deeper, something that settled into place without needing to be announced. And I knew, without saying it out loud, that I was no longer in a position to wait, no longer in a place where observation alone was enough. But still, I didn't act immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I understood that acting without clarity could create a different kind of damage. And I needed to be sure, not just for myself, but for what would come next. Because once I moved forward, there would be no going back, no undoing what would follow. And that kind of decision doesn't come from impulse. It comes from something more controlled, more deliberate. So I stayed. I watched. I listened. The rest of the day passed in a way that felt stretched, like time was moving slower, just to give me space to notice everything I had ignored before, and every interaction, every small detail, every moment between my son and the children carried a new meaning now, a weight I couldn't remove. And the more I paid attention, the clearer it became that whatever was happening wasn't imagined. It wasn't isolated, it was real, and it had been happening long enough to leave marks that couldn't be hidden completely. That night, I didn't leave when I normally would. I didn't make excuses. I didn't pretend. I simply stayed. And deep down, I already knew what I was going to do. The days that followed didn't bring clarity the way I thought they would. They didn't deliver a single moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, they stretched into something slower, heavier, filled with fragments of behavior that, on their own, could still be explained away, but together formed a pattern that became harder and harder to ignore. And that was the most difficult part of all, not having one clear answer, but having too many small signs pointing in the same direction. I started coming over more often, sometimes earlier, sometimes later than usual, not announcing it, not explaining it, just showing up, blending into routine so it wouldn't raise suspicion. And each time I walked into that house, I carried the same quiet awareness with me, the same alertness that made every movement, every interaction. Every silence felt like something I needed to pay attention to, and the more I did that, the more I realized how much can exist beneath the surface of something that looks completely normal from the outside. My granddaughter's behavior didn't improve, not in any meaningful way. And that alone told me something, because if this had been just a phase, just a temporary emotional shift, I would have seen some variation, some moments where she returned to how she used to be. But instead, what I saw was consistency, a steady, quiet withdrawal that didn't fluctuate much, and that kind of consistency doesn't come from nothing. It comes from something that repeats, something that doesn't resolve on its own. There were moments that stood out more than others, small but powerful in the way they revealed what words could not, like the way she would position herself in rooms, always choosing a place where she could see who was entering and leaving, or the way she avoided being alone in certain parts of the house, finding reasons to stay close to open spaces, to shared areas, to places where she wouldn't be isolated. And these weren't conscious decisions you would expect a child to make. They were instinctive, protective, built from something she had learned without ever saying out loud. My son remained unchanged on the surface, moving through his routine with the same detached presence, the same lack of emotional connection I had started to notice more clearly now, and I found myself watching him in a way I never had before, not as a parent looking at a child, but as someone trying to understand behavior, trying to see beyond the familiar. And what unsettled me the most wasn't something obvious. It was the absence of something, the absence of awareness, the absence of sensitivity to what was happening around him. At night, the tension grew stronger, not because something visibly happened every time, but because of the anticipation, the waiting, the awareness that something could happen. And that kind of waiting does something to your mind. It stretches your thoughts. It amplifies every sound, every small movement, every shift in the environment. And I found myself staying awake longer than I should have, listening to the house, to the quiet, to the subtle signals that might confirm what I was already starting to believe. More than once, I almost convinced myself to stop, to step back, to tell myself I had gone too far in my thinking. Because the truth is, there's a point where suspicion becomes exhausting, where carrying that kind of awareness starts to wear you down. And part of me wanted relief. Part of me wanted to return to a version of reality where everything was fine, where my son was still the person I believed him to be, where this was all just a misunderstanding. But every time I got close to that, something small would pull me back. A look, a reaction, a silence that lasted just a little too long. And I understood then that this wasn't something I could walk away from anymore, not without ignoring everything I had already seen, everything I had already felt. And once you reach that point, there's no real choice left, not if you're willing to face the truth. By the end of those days, I wasn't just observing anymore. I was preparing, not loudly, not visibly, but internally, because deep down, I knew that waiting any longer wasn't going to change anything, and that the next step would have to come from me. By the time I reached that point, it no longer felt like a question of whether something was wrong. It felt like a question of how long I'd been willing to look away. And that realization stayed with me in a way I couldn't shake. Not because it brought clarity, but because it brought responsibility. The kind that doesn't give you space to remain neutral. The kind that forces you to choose between comfort and action. And I understood, finally, that staying silent any longer wasn't just avoidance, it was participation. That thought alone was enough to change everything. I stopped trying to find alternative explanations. I stopped looking for reasons that would allow me to step back. And instead, I focused on what needed to be done, not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately, because I knew that whatever I was about to do had to be done the right way, with awareness, with control, with the kind of precision that comes from understanding that one wrong move could make things worse instead of better. That evening, I stayed again. But this time it was different. I wasn't observing anymore. I was waiting, not passively, not uncertainly, but with intention, with a clear understanding that this night would not end like the others, that whatever had been happening behind closed doors would not continue without interruption. Not while I was there, not while I was paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Dinner passed in the same quiet rhythm, the same subtle tension beneath the surface. My granddaughter speaking only when necessary, My grandson trying to keep things light without fully understanding why the atmosphere felt heavier than usual, and my son, once again, moving through it all as if nothing had changed, as if everything was still exactly the way it had always been. And I watched him carefully, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of focused awareness that left no detail. Unnoticed, after the lights began to go out, one by one, and the house settled into that familiar nighttime silence, I positioned myself in the living room, not directly visible from the hallway, but close enough to hear everything, to catch even the smallest movement, and I turned off the television, not wanting anything to interfere with what I was listening for, not wanting any distraction to break the concentration I knew I would need. Time moved slowly. Every minute felt longer than it should. Every sound carried weight. The faint creak of the floor, the soft shift of air when a door opened somewhere in the house, the almost imperceptible rhythm of footsteps moving down the hallway, and I stayed still, completely still, letting my senses adjust to quiet, letting my mind remain focused without drifting, because I knew that if I missed a moment, even by a few seconds, everything could slip away again. And then I heard it, a door opening, not loudly, not carelessly, but slowly, deliberately, followed by footsteps, measured, familiar, moving in the direction I had been expecting and hoping I was wrong about. My chest tightened, not in panic, but in recognition, in that final confirmation that everything I had been piecing together was no longer just a possibility. And as I sat there listening, feeling every second stretch into something heavier, I realized that this was it, the moment where doubt no longer had a place, the moment where action was no longer optional. I stood up, quietly, carefully, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving, because once you reach a certain point, there is no more waiting. And without making a sound, I followed him down the hallway. I moved down the hallway slowly, each step placed with care, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I understood that this moment required control, required awareness. And as I followed the faint sound of movement ahead, I could feel everything inside me sharpening, my senses, my thoughts, even my breathing, like my entire body had aligned itself around a single purpose. And the closer I got to that door, the clearer it became that whatever I was about to face would not allow me to go back to who I was before this night. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He walked with a kind of quiet certainty that made everything feel even heavier. And when he reached her door, he paused just briefly, as if listening, as if making sure the house had settled completely into silence. And then, without looking back, he opened it slowly and stepped inside, closing it behind him with a softness that felt intentional, controlled, and in that moment, something inside me shifted from doubt into action completely, because there was no longer any space left for uncertainty. I stood outside that door for a fraction of a second, not frozen, but aware that crossing that threshold would mean stepping into something irreversible, something that would redefine everything that came after, and I placed my hand on the handle, feeling the weight of the moment in a way I had never experienced before, not as fear, but as responsibility. And without allowing myself another thought, I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by a small, soft light that barely touched the edges of the walls. And what I saw inside wasn't chaos. It wasn't something loud or immediately dramatic. It was something quieter, something that required attention to understand. My son standing too close, too still, in a way that didn't belong in that space. And my granddaughter not asleep, not relaxed, but alert in a silent, tense way, her body language speaking before anything else could. And in that instant, everything I had been holding back collapsed into certainty. I didn't wait. I didn't analyze. I didn't give him time to explain or adjust, because some moments don't allow for reflection. They demand interruption. They demand presence. And I stepped forward, my voice cut into the silence in a way that even surprised me, firm, controlled, leaving no space for confusion, and both of them turned at once. My son caught off guard, his expression shifting in a way that confirmed more than any words could, and my granddaughter frozen in place, as if she had been holding herself still for longer than I could imagine. There was no immediate reaction, no loud confrontation, just a pause, heavy and complete, where everything that had been hidden now existed openly in that room, and I positioned myself between them without thinking, not as a calculated move, but as something instinctive, something that came from a place deeper than logic. And as I stood there, facing him directly, I saw it clearly for the first time. Not the person I had raised, not the version of him I had held on to for years, but something else entirely, something I could no longer ignore or defend. "Leave the room," I said, my voice steady, controlled, not raised, but firm enough to make it clear that this was not a suggestion. And for a brief second he didn't move, like he was processing the shift, like he was trying to understand how control had slipped away so quickly. And in that moment, I understood how fragile everything still was, how easily hesitation could undo what I had just done. So I didn't give him time. I repeated it, stronger, clearer, without breaking eye contact. And something in that moment reached him, something that made him step back, turn, and walk out without another word. The silence that followed was different, no longer tense in the same way, but heavy with what had just been interrupted. And I turned toward my granddaughter slowly, lowering myself to her level, not rushing, not overwhelming her, just being present in a way that didn't demand anything from her. And even though she didn't speak, the way her body shifted slightly, the way her shoulders lowered just enough to show a change, told me everything I needed to know, not in words, but in the absence of the tension that had been there before. And in that moment, standing in that room, with everything finally visible, finally undeniable, I realized something that would stay with me long after that night ended. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as confirmation of something you already knew, but were afraid to face. I stayed there for a few seconds after he left, not because I didn't know what to do next, but because I understood that this moment needed to settle, needed to breathe. And as I looked at her, really looked at her without the noise of doubt clouding everything, I realized how much had been carried in silence, how much had been held back without words. And it became clear to me that what I had interrupted that night wasn't just an action. It was a pattern, something that had been repeating. Quietly, something that shaped the way she moved, the way she thought, the way she existed inside the house without ever saying out loud. I didn't ask her questions. I didn't try to extract explanations or force clarity into something that needed time to be processed. Instead, I stayed present, steady, letting her feel that the situation had changed without demanding that she immediately understand how or why. And I spoke softly, choosing words that were simple enough to hold meaning without overwhelming her, telling her that she was safe, that she didn't have to be afraid anymore, that whatever had been happening had stopped. And as I said it, I realized that those words were not just for her. They were for me as well, because saying them out loud made the decision real in a way nothing else could. After making sure she was calm enough to stay there, I stood up and walked out into the hallway again, the same hallway that had felt so heavy earlier, but now carried a different kind of weight, one that came not from uncertainty, but for what had already been done and what still needed to be done. And I looked toward my son's room. I didn't allow myself to hesitate, because I knew that any delay at that point would only create space for doubt to return, and I had already crossed the point where doubt was no longer acceptable. I reached for my phone with a steadiness I didn't expect from myself, not because I wasn't affected by what had just happened, but because something inside me had settled into clarity, into purpose, and I made the call without pacing, without second-guessing, speaking calmly, explaining what I had seen, not adding emotion, not exaggerating, just stating what had happened in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. And as the words left my mouth, I felt something shift again, something final, something that confirmed that this was no longer a private matter, no longer something contained within the walls of that house. The time between that call and the moment the knock came at the door felt stretched, not in a frantic way, but in a heavy, deliberate way, like every second carried the weight of everything that had just been set into motion. And I stayed in the living room, not sitting, not pacing, just standing in quiet awareness, listening to the house, to the silence that had replaced attention. And even though nothing was happening outwardly, I could feel that everything had already changed. When the knock finally came, it didn't startle me. It didn't break anything. It simply marked the continuation of what had already begun. and I walked to the door with the same steady pace, opening it to find the officers standing there, composed, attentive, carrying with them the presence of something official, something structured, something that now existed beyond my control. And as I stepped aside to let them in, I understood that this was the moment where responsibilities shifted, where what I had witnessed would now be examined, addressed, and taken further. I explained everything again, clearly, without hesitation, guiding them through what I had seen, what led up to it, what made me act, and they listened without interruption, asking only what was necessary, moving with a calm efficiency that made the situation feel grounded in a way I hadn't felt before. And when one of them walked down the hallway toward my son's room, I felt the tension return for a brief moment, not as doubt, but as anticipation, as the final step in something that had already been decided. There were no raised voices, no chaos, just controlled movement. The door opening, words exchanged in tones I couldn't fully hear, footsteps shifting, and then, after a few moments, my son stepped out into the hallway, escorted, no longer moving with the same quiet certainty as before, but with something else, something stripped of control, and when his eyes met mine for a brief second, there was no need for words, no need for explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. As the door closed behind them and the sound of their presence faded into the distance, the house fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't the kind of silence that hides something. It was the kind that follows truth, the kind that remains after something has been interrupted before it could go further. And as I stood there, alone in that moment, I realized that even though everything had changed, even though nothing would ever return to what it had been before, something important had been protected. The days that followed didn't bring relief the way most people imagined it would. They didn't arrive with a sense of closure or peace. Instead, they unfolded slowly, carrying a weight that settled into every part of the house, into every movement, into every silence. And I realized very quickly that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good in the way we expect. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't make everything lighter overnight. But it does something more important. It creates a space where things can begin to heal, even if that healing takes time. My granddaughter didn't suddenly become the person she used to be, not immediately, but there were changes, small at first, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking closely. The way she moved through the house with just a little less tension in her shoulders, the way she stayed in her room without constantly checking who was nearby, the way her eyes slowly began to lift again, not fully, not all at once, but enough to show that something inside her had shifted, that something that had been pressing down on her had been interrupted before it could take deeper root. I didn't push her to talk. I didn't ask her to explain what she didn't yet have the words to explain, because I understood that healing doesn't come from forcing clarity. It comes from restoring safety, from giving someone the space to exist without fear long enough for their voice to return on its own. And instead of asking questions, I stayed present, consistent, allowing her to feel that nothing around her would shift unpredictably anymore, that she could begin to trust the environment again, even if slowly. My grandson stayed close to me during those days, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that reflected something deeper, something intuitive, like he understood that his voice had mattered, that what he had said, even in the simplest form, had changed the course of everything. And every time I looked at him, I was reminded of how easily that moment could have been ignored, how easily I could have dismissed his words, smiled, nodded, and moved on without ever looking deeper. And that thought stayed with me more than anything else. Not what I had seen, not what had happened, but what could have happened if I had done nothing. Because the truth is, the moment that changes everything doesn't always look important at first. It doesn't arrive with noise or urgency. Sometimes it comes quietly, wrapped in something small, something easy to overlook. And if you're not paying attention, if you choose comfort over awareness, it passes by without ever being acknowledged. I thought about that night more times than I can count, about the second before I stood up, before I walked down that hallway, before I opened that door, and I realized how thin the line was between action and inaction, how easily I could have chosen to stay where I was, to wait just a little longer, to give myself another reason not to interfere. And every time a thought crossed my mind, I felt the same thing, not fear, not regret, but understanding. Understanding that silence can protect or it can allow. Understanding that hesitation can feel safe, but can cost more than we realize. Understanding that sometimes the difference between something continuing and something being stopped is one person choosing not to look away. And what stays with me the most isn't the confrontation. It isn't the moment everything was exposed. It's something much simpler, something quieter, something that could have easily been missed if I hadn't been paying attention. A whisper, a small voice barely audible, a moment that didn't demand attention, but needed it. If you ever find yourself in a moment like that, don't ignore it. If something feels wrong, don't explain it away. Because not every warning comes loudly. And not every danger looks the way you expect. Sometimes it starts with something small, and whether it ends there or becomes something bigger depends on whether someone chooses to act. If this story made you think, even for a moment, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the awareness is what makes the difference.